I'm Brian Curtis.
I'm Wendy Ring. Welcome back to Cool Solutions, stories of climate action from the bottom up. I broke the wrist of my editing hand, so until that heals, we'll be bringing back some of our favorite past episodes. I found this one especially inspiring because it's about two women, both middle-aged, both self-proclaimed introverts, who stepped up to protect the places they call home. Some pretty great stuff happened after this first aired in 2021, which I've added in at the end. We tend to think of Americans as being highly mobile, but actually 72% of us remain in or near the town we grew up in. These long-term relationships with place are causing a new kind of grief as climate change alters the seasons, traditions, and landscapes we thought we could count on. But these same connections are also leading some to stand up against tremendous odds to protect the land, waters, and communities they hold dear.
I've been on a shrimp boat probably since I was 8 years old.
That's Diane Wilson, a fourth-generation fisherwoman out of Seadrift, Texas.
When you have a fishing family, the place that is home is the bay. You notice the currents, the color, what the fish are doing, how the dolphins are acting.
In the 1960s, fishermen began to notice something else.
Chemical plants all along the bay, Alcoa, Formosa, Union Carbide, Dow, DuPont, Interplat. When you would go past them at nights, they looked like a fairyland.
By the late 1980s, it was plain to fishermen that something was wrong.
Local shrimping was beginning a decline from which it has yet to recover.
When my dad was shrimping, Seadrift probably had 120 boats. You could go out in August, shrimp till November, December, and you could make enough of a living that you could last the winter. Now the season is over with in several days. We might have 3 boats that go out fishing now. I was running a fish house because I wasn't making any money shrimping. One of the shrimpers that I took care of, I unloaded his shrimp, I gave him ice or fuel, wrote out his ticket at the end of the week. He had 3 different types of cancer, and one day he came in, he pitched a newspaper at me. And on the front of the paper were the headlines, our tiny little county. I mean, we were 18,000 in the entire county. We were number 1 in the nation for toxic waste. We had half the waste in the state of Texas.
And a lot of that waste was finding its way into the bay.
I am basically an introvert. I am one of these people that doesn't like to speak. I don't like to be around crowds. I can remember when I was a child hiding under a bed to get away from people. It was probably a reason why I was so good on the bay, because there's a lot of solitude out there. But when I saw that article, I did something totally out of character. I walked down to City Hall and I said, I want to have a meeting about this information. By the next day, I had the city secretary down at the fish house. Nobody comes down to the fish house. Trust me, it's just fishermen with boots and smelling like shrimp. And here was the city secretary in this nice flowery dress. And she was like, Diane, you're going to have to not do this. And I'm like, well, okay, well, I'll take it to the cafeteria, the elementary school. And they're like, no, Diane, you have to take it entirely out. The bank president, who I had never talked to in my life, come out on the dock and he said, Diane, are you trying to start a vigilante group to roast industry alive? Economic development called my brothers and they told them to make me shut up and not have this meeting. They were trying everything to shut me up.
Undeterred, Diane invited elected officials.
County commissioner, the county judge, the senator, mayors, and every one of them refused to come. The senator went on TV and said he was not going to that meeting.
Despite the lack of interest from politicians, there was good reason for a fishing town like Seadrift to be alarmed.
In our bay system, 5 companies discharge directly to the bays. You're looking at 25, 30 million gallons a day going into the estuaries, nursery areas critical habitat of the crabs and the fish and the shrimp, and this is where their discharge is.
One of the major polluters was a plastics plant owned by a Taiwanese company called Formosa. When its wanton pollution sparked massive protests in Taiwan, the company decided to build plants in the U.S., and Texas bent over backwards to attract them.
Texas gave them anything they wanted. They said, we will make sure you don't have to do any permit hearings. We will make sure everything's expedited. They gave them millions upon millions in tax abatements.
And when it came to pollution, they looked the other way. Now the company wanted to expand, and the same agencies were prepared to quietly rubber stamp their permits.
Diane requested a public hearing. That brought more visitors to the docks.
I had a bunch of fishermen sitting in my office, and they saw this black shiny car scoot up to the fish house, and they thought it was the IRS, so they all climbed through the window and took off. It was just the plant manager, and he had all these little papers, and he just wanted me to sign, just give up my request for the hearing. I had no support. I had no money. I had 5 kids. It was a really tough time. Fishermen believe the last nail was being nailed in their coffin. When I would go to them trying to get them to come to meetings or sign petitions, they're like, Diane, you can't fight City Hall. The foremost spokesperson for the fishermen in our county happened to be my cousin, and Formosa hired him as a consultant for $65,000 a year. And all he had to do was, when Formosa wanted to go before the commissioners or go before the state agencies, they wanted this fisherman to say, I represent fishermen in Calhoun County, and we like what Formosa's doing. And also, they wanted him to get information about what I was doing. Often he would come to the fish house and he'd say, Diane, give me some information to give to him. And I'd say, will you tell me some information and I might tell you? You know, I got information on Formosa that way.
The few allies Diane did have were either bought off or scared off by the company. Formosa intimidated the board members of Diane's fledgling organization by threatening them with lawsuits. When they all quit, she recruited new ones, poor divorced women with nothing to lose.
Formosa just came in without permits, violating law after law, and just started building.
Diane had a volunteer lawyer working on an injunction to stop construction.
Formosa went after my lawyer, and they literally took my lawyer. I was so despondent. It was like I couldn't stop fighting them, but I couldn't keep on. I went through this very, very dark night of the soul.
So dark that it felt like the only way out was suicide.
I was going to go out like Marilyn Monroe. And I got 2 packages of sleeping pills, 2 bottles of alcohol. I took my boat far into the bay, got on the stern as far to the end as I could, and I laid down and I was like, I'm going to go to sleep and I'm going to roll off into the water. That was how I wanted to go. But, you know, the funny thing is, I could not go to sleep. I sat there and finally realized I was not going to go to sleep. I was not going to die. So I pulled up the anchor, took back home, and started all over again. That was my dark night of the soul.
Meanwhile, Formosa's expansion kept expanding.
They were going to be discharging 4 to 7 million gallons a day of toxic waste into Lavaca Bay.
By this time, Diane, who never went past high school, had taught herself to write her own legal briefs. She had an appeal on the water permit pending in federal court.
Legally, they could not discharge until the appellate judge responded.
Then Diane learned that the plant Formosa built without a permit was now discharging chemical waste without a permit.
The EPA said, well, it's really up to our discretion if we want to do it or not. When it comes down to the company with a lot of money, the law doesn't matter. And I was so outraged.
She decided to protest by sinking her shrimp boat on top of the plant's outfall pipe.
My cousin, who had been hired by Formosa to watch me, told Formosa. Formosa told the Coast Guard.
Before she got near the pipe, she was intercepted by 3 Coast Guard boats.
They had these huge microphones, and they said I was a terrorist on the high seas and I was going to the jail for 19 years. They tied my boat with 10 or 11 ropes, and I was lassoed into my cabin.
That was finally too much for the other fishermen.
I heard this noise, and I looked out the window, and all of these shrimpers, they went out in the middle of the bay and did a demonstration. They had their hands out the window in this fist of defiance and rebellion. It was unbelievable.
The coverage of that protest by big city media so embarrassed Formosa that they agreed to recycle their waste instead of dumping it into the bay, at least on paper. But workers at the plant told Diane a different story.
They're like, Diane, I'm going to tell you something, but I don't want you to use my name. And don't ask me to say it to anybody else but you.
Dale Jurassic, a wastewater foreman at Formosa, arranged to meet her at a bar 40 miles out of town to tell her how supervisors instructed him to dilute samples of discharge water before sending them to the lab, and about millions of plastic pellets being washed into the bay. He tried to blow the whistle. He even called the FBI.
The FBI took a picture of it, and they never did anything with it. Absolutely nothing.
That's when Diane, Dale, and a few other Formosa workers finally took things into their own hands and started collecting the discharged plastic pellets, also known as nurdles.
We had to collect because the EPA wasn't doing anything. The state wasn't doing anything. We would use these little nets you use when you got an aquarium. And eventually there were so many of them, we were using pool nets. You would put them in these little, irony of it, were in these little plastic sandwich bags. Sometimes they were quart bags. Sometimes they were gallon bags. Sometimes they were trash can fulls, bucketfuls. The workers were afraid of being caught with them, so I would stick them in my barn.
With the help of Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, Diane took Formosa to court for violating the Clean Water Act. Formosa claimed they were only discharging trace amounts of plastic. So when the case went before the judge, the nurdle collection came too.
Someone had a goat cart and they lended it to me, and we loaded 35 big plastic bins, and we took them to federal court in Victoria, and we hauled them straight in where they got those little security booths. They nearly had breakdown when they saw us trying to load those bins in.
Then Formosa claimed that the plastic wasn't theirs, but data collected by hundreds of citizen scientists blew that fib out of the water.
Jace Tunnell is the reserve director of the Marine Science Institute at the University of Texas. His group studies how nurdles in the Gulf soak up toxic chemicals.
We're looking at PCBs, PAHs, DDTs, all those acronyms you hear about that absorb into those plastics.
Tiny pieces of this contaminated plastic get eaten by marine life, affecting everything from feeding to reproduction, and work their way up the food chain to people.
So Jace was concerned in the fall of 2018 when he found oodles of nurdles washed up on one of his reserve's beaches.
There were so many of them that I did a post on social media, and immediately somebody said, you need to call the Coast Guard. They ended up calling the state agency. And so the next day I met the state agency out at the beach, called me a couple of days later and said they weren't going to pursue it because they thought it was a spill from offshore or from another country.
Jace wanted to know how far and how fast those nurdles on the beach could travel, so he started a Facebook page to recruit some volunteers.
We were looking at this small stretch of beach that's about 40 miles long, so we figured we needed 4 to 5 volunteers to help us out.
Within a few days, they had over 300.
And it wasn't just on that 40-mile stretch of beach. It was every state in the U.S. on the Gulf Coast, plus organizations and universities down into Mexico.
They called themselves the Nurdle Patrol. The methodology is simple. Once you find your first nurdle, set a timer for 10 minutes, and then see how many you collect before it goes off.
That way we can compare concentrations from one location to the next.
And lo and behold,
these aren't spills that are happening in another country. It's not from offshore. Find the highest concentrations way up in the bay systems where the highest concentrations of plastic manufacturing sites are.
That convinced the judge that Diane's bins of nurdles were Formosa's smoking gun.
And we won, believe it or not. I've never saw anything like that in my life.
The judge found that Formosa was a serial offender for its years of violating the Clean Water Act and ordered them to pay $50 million, the highest penalty ever imposed in a Clean Water citizen action suit.
The $50 million will go toward restoring the bay, a sustainable fisheries cooperative, research on the health of the estuary and marine microplastics, including the Nurdle Patrol, and environmental education of the next generation. You are listening to Cool Solutions, stories of climate action from the bottom up. We're hearing from Gulf Coast residents who took on a polluting multinational petrochemical company. Formosa's Point Comfort plant is just one of hundreds of petrochemical plants that have been built or dramatically expanded over the last decade or are slated for construction. Now we're moving on to St. James, Louisiana, where people are fighting the company's plans to build one of the largest petrochemical plants in the world.
This place was so beautiful at one time. I would travel, go on vacation, and I always wanted to come back to St. James. I never seen anywhere in this world that I wanted to live but St. James. And now the industry have taken part of St. James away from us, and we want it back.
That's Sharon Lavigne, founder and president of Rise St. James, a local group fighting to stop the Formosa plant.
My daughter called me and told me that the governor was in St. James Parish announcing the approval of a $9.4 billion industry. When I went home that evening, I turned on the news and I saw for myself our representative, our senator, and some of the parish council members and the parish president. They were there celebrating with the governor.
St. James Parish is one of the Louisiana counties along a stretch of the Mississippi River called Cancer Alley. This 80-mile corridor between Baton Rouge and New Orleans hosts 200 petrochemical plants and is one of the most polluted regions in the U.S.
If the Formosa complex, which bears the Orwellian title The Sunshine Project, is allowed to be built, it would be one of the largest polluters of carcinogenic benzene and ethylene oxide in the nation, and would add thousands of tons of soot and ozone to already polluted air.
It would be too much toxic in the air for us to breathe. We will not live. That's why I'm fighting for my life and the life of my community.
Formosa didn't land in Sharon's backyard by accident. Ann Rolfes is the founder and director of the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, a group that's been helping communities like Sharon's fight polluting industries for 20 years.
St. James Parish as a whole is 50-50 black and white. That seems like there's integration. But if you look more closely, the districts are actually segregated. Fundamentally, the parish has what amounts to a racial cleansing document.
It's called zoning. In 2014, shortly after turning down 2 petrochemical plants in a predominantly white district, the parish quietly opened 2 predominantly black residential districts to industrial development. Within a year, 8 new plants came in, and Sharon watched verdant fields turn into a noxious industrial wasteland.
And as tax revenues from industry rose, the proceeds went disproportionately to the white communities, while the black communities suffered systematic disinvestment.
They sold our grocery stores. They closed our post office. They sold our high school and brought in industry.
Now, the predominantly black 4th and 5th districts have 21 large petrochemical plants and refineries. Air pollution has increased 600%. And residents of nearby towns like Welcome, 97% black, and St. James, 98% black, are getting sick.
So many of my friends are sick with cancer and other problems.
Rise St. James is only 2 years old, and 2 of its 20 members have already passed away.
There were the 2 that was with me on the first meeting that I had at my house, sitting in my den, and they're gone.
Another Rise St. James member, Myrtle Felton, spoke during a 2019 march from New Orleans to Baton Rouge.
My name is Myrtle Felton. I'm a resident of St. James Parish. I've lived there all my life. I've seen businesses closed, banks closed, school closed, post office closed. We have nothing in 4 district but chemical plants.
She told about a traumatic 4-month period in her life when she lost 4 family members, one after the other, to pollution-related diseases.
I never thought that chemical plants would cause that much damage to a family. And things are getting worse. They promise jobs that our people don't get.
That's right.
All we get is debt, sickness. It's just devastating to have to live here, and it's like nobody cares. Nobody cares about nothing when it comes down to our community.
Even though the 14 plants in Formosa's mega complex would exacerbate pollution and more than double the cancer risk for nearby residents, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality approved their air permits. When Rise St. James took the permitting agencies to court and Louisiana's Democratic governor defended them, Reverend Dr. William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign had this to say.
If he supports Formosa and people die, he's just as guilty as that cop that put his knee on George Floyd and strangled him. Because we can't just be moved when people die on camera. People are dying on cancer. I've been there. I've seen the billion-gallon containers that hold all of this poison water that people are worried now if the right storm comes along, if it will burst, and what it could do if it contaminated the river upstream and downstream. I've been there. I've seen the people, and they've decided that they're not just going to die quietly anymore. They're going to fight.
Sharon started out by going to local community groups.
I asked them, what are we going to do about Formosa? And they said, there's nothing we could do about it because the governor approved it. That didn't set good with me in my mind. I was depressed. I was crying. I was so hurt because I thought I had to move. And I just couldn't leave the place where I was raised. I spoke to God, and he told me to fight. And that's what put the spark in me.
So she quit her job as a special education teacher to form a new group, Rise St. James. And as Diane found in Seadrift, it's been hard to get local residents on board.
Me and my organization tried to give them information. Some of them believe and some of them don't. But it's hard to believe your own public officials know that these chemicals will kill us and they won't make us aware. It hurts so bad to know that.
They've done marches, spoken out at public meetings, put ads in the paper, and written letters to the editor. But many local people are afraid to speak out.
Their children and grandchildren that's working in industry, they don't want me to put a sign in their yards.
The group has found regional and national allies. The Louisiana Bucket Brigade got its name from the buckets they once used to help people in polluted areas capture air samples. Director Ann Rolfes says they've pretty much abandoned that tactic.
It's like the Wizard of Oz when the wizard says, bring me the witch's broom. The state will say, prove to us the air is polluted. We do it. We bring it to them, and they still do nothing. I'm not wasting my time bringing the broom when it will bring forth zero action.
Now the Bucket Brigade's major tool is media, to amplify the voices of local residents and expose the shady dealings of state regulators to the light of day. They've got the media spotlight focused on Formosa and are amplifying the voice of Rise St. James. The David versus Goliath battle against Formosa has gotten national coverage. When Biden speaks about environmental justice, he calls out St. James by name.
Rise St. James and the Bucket Brigade also filed a lawsuit contesting permits issued by the Army Corps of Engineers.
It's really illuminating to read that legal brief. My jaw was on the floor. As bad as I know our regulatory bodies can be, and as rotten as I know Formosa Plastics is, it's a whole nother experience to read these legal briefs and have it explained about just how bad it is. The Army Corps didn't even require an environmental impact statement, saying it was insignificant. Now, how the hell can that be true when it would be one of the largest plastics plants in the world? They didn't consider the burden on the Black community. They didn't consider the destruction of wetlands. We have this coastal zone that's fragile. Louisiana is sinking into the sea. Every year there's another hurricane that washes off more of our shores. The way that climate change manifests here is through flooding. And yet, the Army Corps of Engineers is going to give the green light and permit to the largest new source of greenhouse gases in the whole country.
The Corps permit would allow disruption of slave graveyards, something Formosa knew about but failed to disclose.
If they had their way, they would be building on top of these graves and nobody would ever know.
In response to that lawsuit, the Army Corps suspended Formosa's permit for reevaluation. Remember when the fishermen said, you can't fight City Hall? And when Sharon's community organization said, the governor approved it, there's nothing we can do?
There's this idea that these big plants are a done deal or that you can't stop them. And I think with Formosa Plastics, we were really proving that notion wrong. In one corner, we have this huge company, Formosa. In another, we have a small Black community. The odds were against St. James, and they're not dead yet, but we surely have them on the ropes.
Despite Biden's rhetoric about environmental justice, the Army's commander-in-chief did not act to deny Formosa's permit. After grassroots groups submitted over 40,000 public comments, the Army Corps of Engineers did decide to require a full environmental impact analysis shortly after this episode first aired. That report is still pending. 1 year later, a district court rescinded all of the air permits previously granted to the project by the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. The agency and Formosa both announced they'd appeal the decision, but an EPA civil rights investigation conclusion that the department's actions or inactions disproportionately harmed Black residents of Cancer Alley is likely the last nail in the project's coffin. Citing regulatory uncertainty, rising construction costs, public opposition, and falling prices due to expansion of competing plants, industry analysts now say the Sunshine Project will probably never be built. Sharon, Lavigne, and Diane Wilson have both received the Goldman Environmental Prize, recognizing grassroots environmental champions from around the world who take significant action for our planet. Many thanks to Diane Wilson, Sharon Lavigne, Jace Tunnell, and Ann Rolfes for sharing their stories, and to Lahar, Siddhartha Corsis, Huma Huma, and Scott Holmes for our music. If you want to join the fight against plastic or organize a nerdle patrol where you live, you'll find links at our website, cool-solutions.org.